the things that each team does to adapt to lay judges, because this is a round where both teams try very hard to adapt to their judges.
Cool. With that, we can get started.
We negate. Our first contention is the power vacuum. Iran has hegemonic and imperial ambitions that would be emboldened if the United States pulls its military out of the region. Cropsey and Roughead in 2019 explained that eliminating U.S. naval dominance would upend the current balance of power with severe consequences. The pursuit of this mantle in the 21st century has only one true aspirational contender, Iran. Iran's strategy involves expanding its influence through proxies supported by well-placed special operations forces in an attempt to wear down Saudi and Israeli strength. Iran is seeking to export its revolutionary ideology across the Middle East. As Gardner in 2019 explains, that starting with Hezbollah and Lebanon, the Republic is seeking to export its revolutionary ideology and expand its influence beyond its borders ever since the return of Ayatollah Khomeini to Tehran in 1979. Roughead continues that Israel and Saudi Arabia are the two main challenges to Iran's ambitions. The Israeli Defense Forces are the only military in the region of Western quality and proficiency, and Saudi Arabia's kingdom has been remarkably adept at cultivating support. Saudi Arabia remains the custodian of Islam's two holy cities, Mecca and Medina, a position of great religious and political importance. War will break out as the countries clash to fill the power vacuum that the United States will leave behind. As Cropsey and Roughead conclude that in the event of U.S. withdrawal from the region, a long-term regional war between Tehran and Saudi Arabia would cause widespread bloodshed. Iran and Saudi Arabia would be likely to attempt nuclear breakout. An increasingly fractured and war-ravaged Middle East would spawn more jihadist organizations. And absent a reliable U.S. presence, Saudi Arabia will perhaps even Israel would increasingly turn to Russia and China as great power guarantors. Our second contention is Saudi Arabian nuclearization. Knights writes in 2018 that the U.S.-Saudi relationship is built on a simple premise. Washington provides physical security for the Saudi state. True pullout substantially damages our security commitments. As Saab in 2018 confirms, if the U.S. pulls out, the relationship with Saudi Arabia will rapidly deteriorate, and the Saudis see the U.S. military presence in Bahrain as an integral part of their security. Significantly decreasing security commitments with Saudi Arabia could cause them to proliferate. Brown in 2017 concludes that discussion has increased within Saudi Arabia about nuclear weapons. Although proliferation is currently a fringe idea for most U.S. allies, a significant retrenchment in U.S. security commitments could make these ideas viable, particularly for states facing highly acute threats. The impact is war. As the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations finds in 2008, that Israel would likely detect Saudi nuclear activity, and Israel might strike a small number of Saudi targets in order to eliminate the program in its infancy. The Israelis would likely view it as an existential threat, and such an Israeli attack would represent one of the greatest offenses to Muslims in history and would incite a region-wide conflict between the Arab states and Israel. Contention 3 is Iraq. Polanyi in 2020 writes that despite pressure for the U.S. to withdraw, both the Sunni and Kurdish leadership in the country have stood up against the move. That is for two reasons. The first is genocide. Turkey has genocidal ambition against the Kurds. Ahmed in 2019 explains that in Iraqi Kurdistan there is one conclusion. Turkey will not be deterred without the United States. With 2.4 million refugees, Turkey could render Iraqi Kurdistan fatally vulnerable. The central government poses a threat to the millions of Sunni Muslims in Iraq as well. As Nazwad in 2020 explains that after U.S. forces withdrew from the country in 2011, sectarian violence spiked as the Shia-led government carried out killings of Sunni protesters. Now the U.S. has troops in Iraq spread over several facilities, but if the coalition withdraws, then our situation will worsen. The second reason is terror. When ethnic minorities in Iraq face violence from external actors, they empirically turn to ISIS for protection. After the American withdrawal from Iraq in 2011, Nalzad in 2018 explains that local tribes sided with ISIS and the area was quickly overtaken by the group. Thus, Polanyi in 2020 concludes that such discontent could erupt into another armed uprising and result in the resurrection of ISIS. Nowak in 2020 quantifies that U.S. withdrawal from Iraq could result in a resurgence of the Islamic State, putting these people back under ISIS rule, causing major displacement of people again. And 1.8 million internally displaced people are currently in Iraq. Thus, we negate.
Okay, what do you think about this case, Jack? I think that it seems good because it's fairly diversified. There's this power vacuum argument that's just sort of a garden variety war argument. There's this ProLife scenario, which gets to its own ProLife impact plus an Israeli strike impact. And then an Iraq impact that, again, is just totally separate. It seems fairly diversified, which I think we have to think about the value of that for lay audience as well. What do you think?
I totally agree. Yeah, it is a solid case. It's a diversified case. One thing worth considering, though, is that, yeah, like you said, when we have a lay audience, diversification is not necessarily a huge strength, and it can sort of interrupt your ability to create one solid, cohesive narrative. So the fact that the case is diversified is actually probably something that we're going to have to get rid of as the round progresses. We're probably going to want to be coalescing around one idea more and more as the round goes on.
Yeah, that makes sense. That maybe at the outset it's diversified, but that you want to make sure you're telling a clear, cogent story in later speeches. Which of these contentions seems like the best candidate for telling that story?
I think honestly it could be either of them. I think the ProLife one could be pretty good. I also think the like Turkey Kurd genocide one could also be a good one, because there you can sort of make appeals to ethics and whatnot.
Cool. Okay, anything else you want to add before we go forward?
Well, I think that's about it.
Okay, I'll start now. We affirm. Our first contention concerns ending the world's worst humanitarian crisis. As Jones of the Atlantic explains in 2011, the United States military posture emboldens its allies, providing Saudi Arabia and its allies considerable political power to behave badly. Because the United States places tens of thousands of troops around the Arab states of the Persian Gulf, those countries gain leverage over America and feel secure in their aggression. This is especially true in Yemen's civil war, where American military presence has supported and exacerbated the Saudi-led war effort, leading to what the United Nations termed in 2019 the world's largest humanitarian catastrophe. And the blood is largely on the Saudi coalition's hands. Burns of the Washington Post explains in November that nearly 250,000 have been killed, with American-built bombs and missiles being responsible for 2/3 of civilian casualties. But perhaps the most striking feature of the Saudi-led war effort is its focus on economic and humanitarian targets rather than military threats. Wall Street, the New York Times reports that the Saudi-led coalition and its Yemeni allies have imposed a raft of punitive economic measures aimed at Yemen, whose consequences have landed on the backs of civilians. In other words, Saudi Arabia is willing to starve an entire nation of civilians just to weed out a few thousand opponents. Indeed, in addition to opposing a massive economic blockade on Yemen's food and medicine imports, Monday 18 of Tufts University finds that since 2015, Saudi airstrikes have shifted from military and governmental to civilian and economic targets like infrastructure, food production, and hospitals, devastating Yemen's economy. The American military presence has enabled this in two ways. First is by emboldening host nations. American troops bring implicit security guarantees to host nations, as the United States will protect their military presence and thus the host nation in times of danger. This emboldens host nations to act more aggressively and spread their militaries thin, as they know the United States has their back. Indeed, Clark of the National Interest explains in March that the reckless intervention in Yemen was abetted by the stationing of American troops. The Saudi regime and its allies can afford to be obstinate when they have the protection of the world's only superpower. Second is reorienting capabilities. The American military presence enables the war in Yemen by providing essential military assistance to the effort. Schmidt of the New York Times in 2018 explains that American personnel service, repair, upgrade, and provide intelligence for every F-15 taking off from Saudi Arabia. Each pilot is trained by Americans, and every operation relies on American intelligence. Consequently, Nacharos 18 of the New Yorker argues that without foreign assistance, it would be very difficult for the Saudis to wage war. Should the United States withdraw, the Saudi coalition would lose the same support. In fact, Dalton of Defense One in 2017 finds that moving the forces at Al Udeid, a Qatari airbase, would severely impede assistance to Saudi Arabia and the UAE in the Yemen conflict. Even if the Gulf states can continue the war, withdrawing American support would make the war in Yemen strategically unpalatable. With weakened military and an uphill battle in Yemen, Saudi Arabia would be far more likely to pursue negotiations. Thus, withdrawing the American military presence would end the war in Yemen. This is empirically proven, as Wall Street and the New York Times explains that when the Saudis realized in September that they could no longer count on the United States to come to their aid, they reached out to their enemies to de-escalate, driving an 80% reduction in airstrikes. Unfortunately, Parsi 20 of Foreign Policy continues that the cards were reshuffled when Trump ordered the airstrike of Qasem Soleimani, with the region once again moving towards conflict. El Tayyab of The Hill explains that in January, Saudi air raids jumped 294%, and by February, air raids were up another 118%. Overall, stopping the war in Yemen saves millions from poverty and death. True of the Independent in 2019 estimates that by 2022, more than 330,000 children could be dead, with 13.4 million people at risk of starvation. Thus, we are proud to affirm.
So I think the pro takes a very different approach here. Where the con has three contentions that get to some big stick extinction type impacts, the pro is basically just reading more of a soft left, structural violence, war in Yemen kills a lot of people, like high probability, maybe lower magnitude, and just one contention. What do you think is more lay-friendly here? Which approach do you think maybe is stronger?
Honestly, I think their approach is more lay-friendly. I think that when you can stick to higher probability arguments and scenarios where you get to say things like, oh, American support is directly complicit in killing of civilians, the more feasible, the better when it comes to lay. And they also have that sole contention advantage that's helping them to create a narrative. The other thing that they do that I like is that they create or insert a whole lot of spikes and a lot of preemption material against what our responses could possibly be. So I think that's another way in which they're insulating themselves from what we could do later in the round. So overall, I think both cases are good, but I think that theirs is more lay friendly.
Makes sense. What do you think the proper strategy is going to be for the con as the debate progresses? My instinct is probably collapse down to one contention as soon as possible and just have a heavy defensive press on this other contention, coupled with some impact calculus about how war turns structural violence and would worsen the humanitarian crisis. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think your instinct is spot on. I think that's exactly what needs to be done. And that's sort of I think that's pretty much what we do.
Oh, spoiler alert. Okay. I guess we'll see what happens.
10 seconds used.
Ready for cross?
Yeah. So your first link says that the United States emboldens allies with security guarantees because they have presence in those states. So how big is the United States physical presence in Saudi Arabia or anywhere else in the Saudi-led coalition?
We have lots of aircraft carriers stationed near Saudi Arabia. We have many troops in Saudi Arabia. We have missile systems in Saudi Arabia, stuff like that.
That's actually not true. We have 0 troops in Saudi Arabia and only 1,000 in the UAE.
We don't have 0 troops in Saudi Arabia. But also, they don't have to be directly stationed within Saudi Arabia. They can be in the Persian Gulf, and that provides Saudi Arabia with a security guarantee. Could I take a question?
Wait. But that's only the Navy, though, right? Why does the Navy specifically?
We also have troops in Saudi Arabia.
That's not true.
It is true. Could I take a question? Okay. So on your first contention, you say that Iran is going to be emboldened and it's going to fight Israel and Saudi Arabia, right?
Yeah.
And then your second contention, you say Saudi Arabia is going to nuclearize and then Iran's going to fight Saudi Arabia. No, Israel's going to fight Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
So you're saying that Israel's going to be fighting Saudi Arabia and Iran. Saudi Arabia is going to be fighting Israel and Iran. These 3 countries are going to be engaged in 20 different conflicts.
So the evidence in the first contention indicates that the main people who are fighting in that conflict scenario is Iran and Saudi Arabia, and it just it just says that Israel is also a security
Okay. Yeah, so Israel would feel so if Israel's helping Saudi Arabia fight Iran, why would it suddenly attack Saudi Arabia at the same time?
That evidence doesn't say that Israel is helping Saudi Arabia fight Iran.
Okay, so let me ask a different question. Can I rephrase the question?
I'd actually like to have a question. We've been
okay.
So let's talk about the Yemen impact scenario, right? So far as the Houthis have continuously violated every single ceasefire that has happened in the last year or two, why are the Houthis specifically going to agree to Saudi-led efforts to end the war in Yemen?
The reason the Houthis have not agreed to the ceasefires is because the Saudi Arabians aren't conceding enough. When we take away presence in Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabians are no longer as bold, which means that they will concede more negotiations.
Ceasefires, though, are not reliant on concessions. You have ceasefires so you can then have diplomacy where they ask to make concessions.
Yeah, and then they don't believe in the ceasefires because they know the Saudi Arabians aren't going to concede. Can I take a question? Okay, so both of us know that Iran is Israel's biggest enemy, right?
Sure.
Iran literally tweets every day, we want to wipe Israel off the face of this earth, right? Iran is the biggest enemy of Israel. So why would Israel attack a country that is fighting its biggest enemy? The enemy of your enemy is your friend, right? Why would Israel attack Saudi Arabia if it's fighting its biggest enemy?
It's very, very much not that simple, right? Israel
It is that simple.
But you can't just say it is that simple. Israel and Saudi Arabia have just as many ideological divides as Israel and Iran.
No, definitely not. Saudi Arabia does not tweet out every day, we want to wipe Israel off this earth.
You can't just say
that's literally, if you check the supreme leader of Iran's Twitter, he says that all the time. Saudi Arabia actually has diplomatic agreements with it, which is what you say in your first contention.
We're way over time. I don't know where you're going with this at all.
What are some of your impressions about that crossfire? Do you think that either side made much progress? How do you think this was tailored for a lay audience?
I honestly think that their side probably edges us out in this crossfire. The reason I say that is that he was very efficient in the way that he answered questions, and he was always trying to say, like, okay, I've asked and answered, let's move on to the next thing. I think he was pretty darn effective in this cross. I also think that the press on our case about, like, okay, does it really make sense for Saudi Arabia and Iran and Israel to be involved in these two separate war scenarios at the exact same time? I think that that's somewhat of an effective press in front of a lay judge, because if there's one thing you really want to do, it's to make the other team's case sound confusing. And so that aspiration was realized somewhat effectively in this cross by the other team.
Makes sense. What do you think? How do you think you should really change up your crossfire strategy when you're in front of a lay audience? Like, what are some do's and don'ts that you think maybe the teams in this debate did a good job or not as good job following?
I think the teams in this debate did a pretty good job following it. I think you just really want to be pressing your opponents on the parts of their case that are illogical or don't really pass the smell test intuitively. Those are the sorts of areas where you want to get into prolonged debates, where you're going really deep down the rabbit hole and you're having to push or defend on one side. Just really pick areas where you think that you're, to the average person, seeming to be intuitively reasonable.
I agree, and I think that there's a good example of that when there's that discussion about Israel and Iran and Saudi Arabia, and that sort of pithy catchphrase, the friend of my enemy is my friend, that sort of seems like the type of thing that can really stick with a lay judge and really resonate. That's a good thing to get in there in cross-ex, to really simplify, a complex dynamic.
Definitely.
Cool, we'll keep going.
All right, that's 13 seconds used. All right, is everyone ready? All right. Let's begin by discussing the current condition of the war in Yemen. We both agree that it's very bad, but there is improvement happening in the status quo. Hubbard in 2020 explains that Saudi Arabia recently announced the kingdom and its allies would observe a ceasefire in Yemen. It's the first major step towards peace and the biggest one we've seen in the history of the war. Making Saudi Arabia insecure by pulling out would only jeopardize what progress we are seeing in the status quo. But secondly, a negotiated solution actually relies on other sides in the conflict like Iran and Saudi Arabia coming together to solve their problems. But absent American presence forcing local states to work together, that won't happen. Jan writes in 2020 that given the deep-rooted ideological and political divisions between key players, it is difficult to envision a new Islamic bloc creating harmony. Discord and divisions have afflicted the Muslim world. Next, let's talk about their specific links. Let's begin with some weighing, though. We need to ensure that Iran doesn't become more aggressive if America withdraws, if we want to prevent Saudi Arabia from becoming more aggressive as well. And history teaches us that if America withdraws, even fears that Iran will expand to fill that power vacuum we leave behind are enough to spur Saudi Arabia to expand. Rupra in 2017 explains that after the Libyan intervention in 2013, Saudi Arabia feared America would withdraw and vacate the region, which caused them to fund proxy conflicts. Thankfully, America didn't wind up withdrawing from the region, but this period of instability demonstrates that what happens when Saudi Arabia thinks we're going to withdraw, that's more violence and more bloodshed. But the second response to their first link here about how Saudi Arabia is emboldened relies on an assumption that our security commitments are unconditional and that Saudi Arabia relying on us for all of their security means that somehow they have leverage over us. The exact opposite is true. Jordan in 2019 explains that last year, when America temporarily ended mid-air refueling of Saudi jets, Riyadh backed a ceasefire. In dealing with Saudi Arabia, America's choice has never been between blithely accepting Saudi conduct or severing our relations. Presidents from FDR to Ronald Reagan have found ways to preserve American values while selectively cooperating when it is in our interest. But third, if we make Saudi Arabia fear for their safety, they'll make escalatory and dangerous decisions. Terrell 2013 explains that U.S. land power remains profoundly relevant to deterring recklessness by regional powers in the Middle East. Regional partners need greater assurance if unfavorable political developments occur, like the instability we're seeing on Saudi Arabia's border. On the second link about how we're able to completely basically destroy Saudi Arabia's military by affirming the resolution. Several problems here. Firstly, we don't contest that the Saudis are committing war crimes. However, unilaterally destroying their military is a crazy solution to the conflict because it would grant the victory to the other side in the conflict, the Houthi rebels. That would be a disaster. Matthews in 2018 explains that the leader of the Houthis in Yemen have unmistakable genocidal intent. Like the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, the Iranian-backed Houthis appear willing to purge Yemen of all its religious and cultural diversity, including a genocide of the Baha'i minority. Secondly, U.S. withdrawal and destroying the Saudi military means the Houthi rebels would have no reason to negotiate because the side they're fighting can't do anything. Knights et al. In 2019 explains that withdrawing U.S. support will embolden the Houthis and their Iranian supporters, making them much less likely to accept any sort of agreement. But let's back up for a second and even examine the initial claim they present, which is that American assistance, not arms sales, not forces, specifically American military force in the Persian Gulf, is what is allowing Saudi Arabia to conduct these airstrikes. That's not true for 3 reasons. Firstly, their evidence about how key the U.S. is to the war effort is very weak. It just says, on average, we help with the maintenance of a lot of repair jets. Saudi Arabia has a $500 billion sovereign oil fund. They can pay for munitions. They can pay for all of these things. But secondly, Knights in 2018 explains that Saudi Arabia is stockpiling enough materials to allow them to continue the war for decades, even if America cut off all security ties. But thirdly, even if they did lose access to all fighter jets, Parsi 2019 explains that Saudi Arabia has bought dozens of fighter jets from Britain, so in a worst-case scenario for them, they could fall back on those. Don't just destroy the Saudi military, or at least try to, because you'll then give the conflict to a genocidal Houthi rebel group. Vote for the con.
So I think the strategy here from a substantive perspective is interesting. Basically, it just pushes back on the fundamental premise that the Saudis are necessarily the bad guys here, that maybe the conflict going the other way would be just as bad. And there's, of course, also some link defense that Saudi will do worse things if aid is cut off, but it just feels almost like it's close to an impact turn in some ways, that if you settle the war on the terms that the pro thinks you should, that will make it worse, which is interesting from a technical perspective, but I wonder how it works with a lay audience. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it definitely is similar to an impact turn. I honestly think that it does / can work on a lay audience, because I think that lay people understand that wars are, very complicated, especially conflicts like these. And if you are taking one group out by force, then that obviously creates a big question about, okay, who's the winning group? So I think that this question is a pretty darn strong one to rely on answering. I also think that the other thing I do in this speech that's good is that the signposting is pretty darn heavy. So I'll give a brief re-explanation of all the critical assumptions that they give before I then start to answer those assumptions. And making sure that you're doing that is a great way to prevent lay judges from getting confused.
I totally agree. What are some things that you think maybe the speech could have done better?
I think that I could have used a bit more offense. I think probably on the link level, not just on the sort of impact turning stuff as it pertained to the Houthi rebel group. That's the biggest one.
Okay, that makes sense. And I guess one thing I'm thinking about is how the next speech will really try to counter a lot of this. It seems like there is a diverse set of stuff to answer in terms of, the impact turn about perhaps the Saudis aren't the only ones at fault. Some of the stuff about a negotiated solution requires having military assistance. I'm interested in to see how the other side will, the next speech will handle this. I guess we'll go ahead and see.
Our argument is that Saudi Arabia is committing genocidal atrocities within Yemen. My opponent's first response is that they had a ceasefire, but this ceasefire is fake news. First, Saudi Arabia is still committing the blockade, which Vox explains in 2017 is killing hundreds of thousands of children over a couple of months. And second of all, the Hubbard evidence they cite still says it's the first step on a very long path to peace. Second, my opponents say that it's very hard for the Saudi Arabians to be able to negotiate with the Houthis, but they don't respond to our New York Times evidence that says when the Saudi Arabians saw that the United States were decreasing their commitment in 2019, they started negotiating and we saw real progress. There was an 80% decrease in airstrikes. My opponents say that historically, Saudi Arabia has lashed out in 2013 in Libya. The Libya example is not as good as our evidence because our evidence is talking about Yemen. It says that Saudi Arabia became less aggressive in Yemen when the United States indicated they were no longer backing them. Then my opponents say that the United States has lots of leverage over Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia has a lot of leverage over the United States too. So let's look at what's happened. My opponents simply say that in one instance in 2019, we ended in-air refueling to stop the Saudi Arabians and make them do a ceasefire. What has happened since then? The ceasefire has been broken. They're killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. 2/3 of deaths are because of the Saudi Arabians. They're bombing out farms and airfields. So even if the Donald Trump administration might have some leverage, it clearly is not working. My opponents also say that the United States deters recklessness from Saudi Arabia. Look at the last 5 years and determine whether Saudi Arabia has been a reckless country or not. They've invaded in Yemen, killing hundreds of thousands of people. They've absolutely failed in the war in Syria. They've also threatened to invade Qatar and implemented blockades there. They killed Jamal Khashoggi. Saudi Arabia is definitely not very stable now. Lastly, let's move to our argument on capabilities. My opponents say that we're absolutely destroying Saudi Arabia's military. That's not true. Like they themselves say, Saudi Arabians have plenty of jets from the British, plenty of different support, and they can get jets from other places as well. Our argument is much simpler than that. Without the United States, Saudi Arabia still has one of the most important backers of its military in Yemen taken away from it. So obviously Saudi Arabia will not be fighting as hard in Yemen. My opponents say that Houthis are really bad. But first of all, Reuters explains in 2020 that the Houthis have no traction in the south, so they're not going to win anyways, and there are 90,000 Yemeni troops there that will stop them. Second of all, they're going to commit this genocide anyways, but the Saudi Arabians are committing the vast majority of the damage. All my opponents' other arguments say that Saudi Arabia can continue war. Our argument is if you reduce their ability to fight the war, it's simply too much for them, and that's why they saw an 80% decrease in air trade. On my opponent's first contentions, they read no evidence that actually says that Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Israel will cause a war or the probabilities of it. They just say it's bad. But like their own evidence says is that Iran uses proxies to fight war. Think about it. Why would Israel, Iran, and Saudi Arabia fight a war? It would be absolutely devastating for the entire Middle East, and they have economic interests there. Rather, Iran's going to continue its own strategy of funding proxy groups. But then second of all, the Foreign Policy magazine explains in 2019 that Iran doesn't have money to fund proxy groups because we have sanctions on Iran. They cut their military spending by 29%. And their own proxy groups are doing austerity measures. So contention one is just null and there. Then on their second contention, the first problem here is they never tell you how those Saudi Arabians are going to get nuclear weapons. Zechariah 15 of the Washington Post explains that Saudi Arabia is ranked 73rd in STEM, and Iran is ranked 44th, and Iran has spent decades trying to get nuclear weapons and has had the United States and Russia help it at different points. Second of all, 9/10 of Saudi Arabia's private sector employees are foreign. Third of all, Forbes explains in 2018 that Saudi Arabia desperately needs to diversify its economy, but once you implement nuclear weapons, you get sanctions, so Saudi Arabia is going to economically collapse. Fourth, Pakistan wouldn't sell to them either because their economy would collapse as well. Moreover, their own argument in their first contention says that Saudi Arabia can turn to Russia, China. It's just so vague here. Lastly, on your argument on the Houthis. The first problem here is that Newsweek explains in 2020 that historically the Houthis in Iraq have turned to Iran for defense. Second of all, ISIS will resurge. The Washington Post explains in 2019 that the conditions simply aren't the same. The Iraqi government is not as sectarian as my opponents say it was back in 2011. And moreover, the people remember that ISIS is really bad. They're not going to join it again. Simply put, ISIS is not going to be as bad as my opponents say it was. Thus, we urge you both to the affirmative.
So I think that that's a good speech. I think that maybe, though, there's a little bit of a mismatch in time allocation, that there could be perhaps more dealing with the Khan's case. And I think this opens the door for the Khan to really get into this with some impact calculus, collapse down to one contention, cut through the pro answers fairly quickly, and then really just weigh it. Because I think that's the path to victory, a fairly positional, collapsing, saying that their offense outweighs their opponents. What do you think?
Yeah, exactly. That was the big thing that helped us out in this round, the time allocation problem in this rebuttal speech. Specifically, I think our last contention really gets undercovered. I think it's only like a couple of responses, and neither of them are very directly responsive to what we said about the Kurds itself. So taking advantage of that, like we always say, you want to go towards low resistance paths to the ballot. And so our case in that area becomes a very, very low resistance option.
I agree. I think that the coverage on their own case is pretty good. It's very thorough. But ultimately, I just think that the other side might just be able to sidestep that by choosing to really just focus on impact calculus and winning their own offense and just, winning that it outweighs.
For sure.
Other comments on the speech?
Nope, I think that's about it.
Cool. Okay, we'll keep going.
Yeah.
All right. So let's begin by talking about your second argument about how we can take away Saudi Arabia's logistics. So which is it? If we end military sales, is the Saudi Arabian military significantly weakened, or are they not affected?
They're weaker. Yeah.
Okay. That's fine. That's all I needed. You can have a question.
Yeah, sure. So I just read your Polanyi evidence from Al Jazeera on your case. So it says that if Iran-aligned Shia parties continue to push for a U.S. withdrawal from Iraq, the unstable political situation could take a dark turn. So, wouldn't the way to solve this be to withdraw American troops to stop the sectarian tensions that are over?
No, not at all, because the reason Polanyi says it takes a dark turn is that if our troops are gone, the central government, A, cracks down on Sunnis, and B, what you don't answer is that Turkey comes in and does a literal genocide of the Kurdish population. There's millions of them in Iraq at the moment. It's called Iraqi Kurdistan. There was no answer to that.
Just to be clear, when I said that historically Iran has supported the Kurds, I mean the Houthis on your contention 3, I meant the Kurds. Like I thought.
Yeah, I thought you meant the Kurds, but that's awfully confusing because Iran is Shia and Iran has fought the Kurds in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. So that's also not true at all.
No. Iran has not fought the Kurds in Iraq, and there's a very specific reason why they like the Kurds in Iraq. No. Our evidence says they've supported the Kurds. Okay, but we're going to disagree on this. But let's think about it logically, right? Iran has a very narrow border.
Okay. Go ahead.
Iran has a very, very narrow border with Iraq, and we can both agree that Iran does not want a massive civil war on its border, especially because they have a really good position there right now. So they would obviously want to prevent Turkey from invading.
No. Yeah. So they might want to prevent it, but he conceded Ahmed evidence explains that no one else is going to be sufficiently able to deter Turkey from invading except America. No other military is near credible enough. That's why when Turkey invaded Syria, despite the fact that even Russia, Assad's regime, also Iran had militias in Syria, no one could protect the Kurds in that region either.
Well, that's actually a really good example.
I'd actually like to ask a question. We spent a while on this.
What? Yeah.
Can we talk? Sorry, it's hard to hear you with this format. Okay, so let's talk about your argument that we're still doing the blockade. The date on that evidence is 2017, correct? The evidence you cited in your first response?
I can give you evidence that says that Saudi Arabia is still doing the blockade from 2020. The 2017 evidence is an estimate as to how much people the blockade was from.
I could give you evidence that says anything, but did you cite evidence in the round that says that we're still doing the blockade?
Yeah, your own evidence says that.
No, it doesn't. But that's
it does.
Okay, thoughts on that cross?
I thought it was a fine cross, mostly uneventful. I don't think either side really got too much out of it. Curious to hear what you think.
I agree. I think that it was a reasonable back and forth. It seems like similar to the other crosses, that there's some disagreement on factual questions, like were there operations in Iraq? Similar to earlier on, are there troops that are stationed in Saudi Arabia? And it would be good if either side could just resolve that definitively, because that's the type of thing that a judge might just feel like, oh, I got to do a quick Google search on my own to figure this out. And importantly, it feels like those other ones didn't really get brought up later in the debate. So I feel like in front of a lay audience, there is some value to being able to, I guess, sort of stunt on your opponent with some factual thing like that, but be able to back it up. What do you think some of the takeaways from this are?
I think you pretty much covered it. I think that a lot of the time, one lesson from this cross is that when you get into a place where it's just you and the opponent just disagreeing on one assertion of fact, it's best to sort of move on from there and to not dwell on that too much and get into a yes, no battle, because that's never very productive.
Totally. Okay, we'll keep going.
Going to win this round on the Kurdish genocide argument, which they really undercover. The Ahmed evidence is really incredibly explicit. It says that there is a large population of Kurds in Iraq that is being currently protected by the United States. The evidence concludes that if the United States military were to leave the region, that protection is gone and the Kurds are left very vulnerable and exposed. That evidence concludes that as a result, Turkey will invade Iraq to commit a genocide on the Kurds on the Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan. The reason that's true is because for years there has been a serious ideological conflict between the Kurds and Turkey. So this is really important. They have literally only one general response to this argument, and it's not very good for two reasons. They say that basically Iran is backing the Kurds. One, Iran is definitely not backing the Kurds. The reason that's true is because the Kurds are Sunni Muslims, and Iran is composed of Shia Muslims. And there has since the existence of the two sects been an ideological divide between the two of them. That's why Iran would not come to their support. But secondly, even if you do believe that Iran is supporting them, our Ahmed evidence says that that is not enough to deter Turkey from attacking. So the only country with a big enough military that is a big enough threat to deter the Turkey from invading is the United States, even if Iran is backing them. So Here's how you weigh this argument. Here's how you weigh a complete genocide of the Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan. We would say you can weigh this on probability. Because if you can look to the example of Syria. As soon as the United States withdrew troops from the Syrian border, Turkey immediately invaded to put pressure on the Kurdish forces. The empirics are literally on our side. There are hardly any responses to this contention. This is very clean. You do not need to evaluate the really messy Yemen debate. But let's go over to there. Let's talk about this Yemen argument. The first thing that they really mishandle is the Hubbard evidence. We tell you that there's improvement in the status quo right now because of United States pressure, and there is a ceasefire that both sides have agreed to. That evidence includes it is the largest step towards peace that we have seen in a really long time. They respond by saying that the Saudi blockade is still there. A, they don't cite evidence that says this, but B, the point is this ceasefire is the first step towards eliminating the blockade. The blockade gets eliminated once these talks are successful. You don't want to jeopardize the talks. You want to vote for us. Also, our evidence indicates that this ceasefire specifically paves the way for peace talks in literally the immediate future. But let's look at some other reasons why the war in Yemen is never going to end, even if the United States pulls out. Jack reads this night's evidence, which is really important. It says that Saudi Arabia for years has been stockpiling United States military equipment, and that Saudi Arabia has a $500 billion oil sovereign wealth fund. Both of these things mean that A, they're always going to have enough materials to continue fighting, and B, they're always going to be able to pay for the same expertise and pay for the same training that the United States was previously getting them. So far as the United States withdrawing does not do anything to influence their ability to fight in Yemen, that means that they are never going to stop. And that is why you vote for us.
So what do you think about the speech coverage and also the speech strategic choice in terms of what contention to go for?
I thought overall this was a really solid speech. I liked the highlighting of the undercoverage of our third contention at the very top of the speech and pointing out the fact that, hey, this means the debate is really clean and it's too late for them to really do anything about this. I think this effectively digs a pretty big hole for them to try and get out of and puts us ahead for the most part in the rest of the debate to where now they're sort of on their heels. That was the biggest takeaway I had from the speech. What did you think about it, Rafi?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because one approach could have been to go for war outweighs, extinction outweighs, etc. And this is more of our humanitarian argument is more important than yours, which has pros and cons. Maybe it's more lay-friendly because a lay audience might be less interested in war arguments. Maybe it's more strategic because there's a lot less friction from the pro in terms of dealing with this Turkey stuff. But on the other hand, there's also a compelling argument that you get access to better weighing arguments if you can go for war outweighs, war turns, humanitarian crises. So I can see arguments either way, but I think this choice is totally defensible.
Yeah, I think that pivoting away from a big stick impact, if it ever makes sense, it makes sense in front of a panel like this one.
Totally. So what do you think the pro needs to do to deal with some of this? My intuition is probably win a large risk of their Yemen argument and then just really try to explode on the defense they did put in the earlier speech, even if there wasn't a ton of it.
My take is a little bit different. I think that one of the biggest things they should do is they should go really hard on Wang because I don't think the defense they give was that great. But going hard on Wang and also fleshing out what defense that they do have are, I think the things for them to do. And then, of course, they need to win a risk of offense on Yemen.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess we'll see what happens.
I'll be starting on my opponent's case and then moving on to our case. Starting now. So they go for their argument on how Turkey is going to invade Kurdistan. The one response we give you is that Iran is going to be backing the Kurds. They say that they're different sects of Islam, so they're not going to back them. This is a complete oversimplification of how the Middle East works and why American foreign policy has generally failed. There's different incentive structures. Iran does not want a full-blown war and genocide to break out on its border, which is why historically when the United States has pulled out of the region and they do not respond to our evidence or our arguments, Iran has backed them, which is why this genocide has never happened, which is why when the United States withdrew from Iraq in 2011, there was no full-blown invasion and there was no genocide. Then they say that they do not have enough military presence to deter. However, number one, there's no historical precedence for this, as in 2011 it did not happen. And number two, and perhaps most importantly, Iran is still going to be able to be preventing a genocide from happening, even if it does not deter them from doing so. Then they try to outweigh on probability by saying that Syria happened. However, this is actually a good example for us because in Syria, no genocide happened. A couple people were displaced and a couple of villages were attacked, but there was no full-blown genocide. My opponent's impact has no historical precedence for it, which is why my opponent's own example disproves their impact, which is why when in Syria, there were one example, there was no genocide. There's no probability you can vote for my opponents on our side of the flow. So they try to say that there's actually a really good ceasefire happening right now. However, they are lying about their evidence. It's not because of American pressure. Hubbard says it's because of the coronavirus, and the coronavirus is going to die out in a while, which is why it's not going to work. But second of all, and perhaps more importantly, their own Hubbard evidence says that the Houthi rebels are not listening to the ceasefire because Saudi Arabia is still maintaining a blockade, which kills hundreds of thousands of Yemeni children. That's their own evidence. They can show you the evidence, and it says that very thing, which is very important because that means that the ceasefire is not working in any way whatsoever, and the only way it will work is if we pull out of the region. This is really, really important because my opponents do not respond to our warrants in any way. We first say that the United States provides Saudi Arabia with a security guarantee to go into the war in Yemen because the United States is backing them up. And also, we do intelligence gathering, repairing, upgrading their intel, etc. These are things that cannot be done without American military presence. The importance of this is because we have true historical precedents. When the United States decreased its presence in Saudi Arabia, this last year, a couple of months ago actually, Saudi Arabia decreased its air strikes 80% and there were no Yemeni deaths. This is the only historical precedent that exists in today's round that is actually accurate and specific, which means our argument is simply much more probable than our opponents. This is especially important because our true evidence in 2019 indicates that 330,000 children are at risk of starvation or are going to die in the next 2 years, and 13.4 million people are at risk of starvation due to the conflict in Yemen. This is extremely important, and it outweighs everything my opponents say because we actually provide you contextualized numbers on what's happening, and it's so many more people than the Kurdistan people, which is obviously a lot more important than. They try to say that Saudi Arabia can just buy weapons and buy other things. However, they are not going to be able to have intelligence gathering, American troops repairing it, and other things like this, which is why overall our evidence from foreign policy says that the United States decreasing its presence in the region decreased airstrikes by 80%, the true historical precedents in today's round.
I thought it was a good speech. There was definitely a good amount of pretty new material in response to the case, which is a little bit iffy coming out of second summary, but I think that in terms of a lay audience, it's disguised at least somewhat well. I thought that, on the other hand, some of the weighing could have been a little bit better. I think that the scope weighing wasn't explained all that well. It's just like, oh, they're just talking about one minority. We're talking about, like, a war. But it's not necessarily clear why starting a war to eradicate that minority group is of lower impact than their war. So I think that needed a bit more fleshing out. So, yeah, overall, I thought it was a good speech, though.
I think more impact calc would help. There's this argument about like no historical precedent for it escalating, but I think that there could be a little bit more that like even if it does escalate, why is the pros impact more important than the cons? Because again, I think your initial comment about there's not a lot of defense is good, which means that you really do need to have some impact calc to cover yourself in that case.
Yeah, that's definitely true. That was my biggest takeaway from the speech as well.
Okay, let's see what happens.
Oh, you'll read your
Yeah.
Okay. So your Parsi evidence, it says that there was an, or I think it's the Walsh evidence. It says there was an 80% drop in airstrikes. No, this wasn't. This is your impact evidence. So I answered the link. This isn't an impact debate. So the point is that you have begun to misrepresent this evidence as the round has gone on. Does it actually say that because of U.S. withdrawal there was a decrease in 80% of airstrikes, or does it say that because of negotiations in the region there was a drop in 80% of airstrikes?
No, so it says that the United States was turning away, and we promised to withdraw. So Donald Trump went out and he said that we will withdraw troops, and then Saudi Arabia turned to airstrikes. I mean, the judges can
that's what the card said.
During this round.
Yeah, that's what it says. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. We'll figure that disagreement out later. Y'all can have a question if you want.
Oh, okay. Niven, you have a question?
Yeah. So you say that like Saudi Arabia is going to be able to like buy all the other things that the United States has. Like, can they buy intelligence gathering capabilities? And can they buy like the expertise to repair their crafts and stuff like that?
Yes, They can purchase engineering services. They can purchase like radar systems. It's not hard.
No, but American troops are like the people who repair their airplanes and provide them with stuff like that. But can they do? What about intelligence gathering, which is required to fight the war?
This is important, right? First of all, on the repair thing, you don't need to have someone directly from the United States government to repair your like equipment that was maybe made in the United States. There are people that are not like that are private contractors that know how to repair things that are not supplied.
Yeah, sure. But wouldn't that be really expensive to because the Saudi war is already costing billions of dollars a month. Wouldn't it be really expensive to hire an external actor to maintain your war?
Right. So one, your point about the expense is A, brand new in Grand Crossfire. You should have made that response earlier. But second of all, Jack makes the analysis that says they have like incredibly deep reserves from their oil sovereign wealth fund, which you also never addressed. On the intelligence, right? And like not having the United States assistance does not preclude you from intelligence gathering. You can A, buy the technologies, B, expand that part of the government, or C, like form alliances.
So basically what you're saying is that Saudi Arabia has $500 billion and they can do all of these things to replace the United States, everything that they're doing for Yemen. I don't think this is very probable, right?
Yeah,
Saudi Arabia at one point had to
hard.
say, this war is getting too expensive. The United States is doing so much things for us, but we cannot replace it. That's why our 80% evidence is so good. And the judges can call for it at the end of the round if they doubt it.
So this is really important, right? Because you also never respond to the Knights evidence, which says that they have stockpiles of military equipment to last them like until the end of the war. So what
It's fine. They have stockpiled bombs, but that doesn't mean that intelligence can be replaced, repairs can be replaced very easily, or security guarantee can be replaced.
Yes, it does. It totally means that.
Okay, well, you can respond to the security guarantee, and you cannot gather intelligence without American presence.
How can you replace one of the largest aircraft strike groups in the world with stockpiled bombs?
It's not just
Again, two things. It's not just bombs. Knight says they have all of the equipment necessary in stockpile to continue the intervention. That includes munitions, spare parts, logistical maintenance, etc. It's not just bombs. Who said it was just bombs?
How do you stockpile intelligence?
None of these.
So all you need to do for intelligence is literally just buy like radar systems. It's not hard. How do you think they got them for us now?
Radar
They
systems
bought
are going
them.
to tell you where people are.
Intelligence is not the linchpin into the Saudi Arabia's like fighting.
Yeah, it is. Wars are fought based on
U.S. is the linchpin, and you can call for evidence. It's so good. It says the United States is crucial to the Saudi Arabian.
What's really interesting here is there's this really late-breaking debate going on about is how important is intelligence versus capabilities. Do you think this is going to have an impact, considering how late it's coming, or what do you think about that whole exchange?
I think it will probably have somewhat of an impact because the way that they frontline it, the only thing that they sort of established that Saudi Arabia can't buy is that intelligence stuff. So they sort of make their link become reliant on that. So the question of whether or not that is the linchpin at this point does seem to become a critical question that determines whether or not they get access to their link or not. It is a bit late for it to be coming up, and it is a bit of a pivot on both teams' parts to be focusing on it so much, but I do think that it still becomes pretty important.
Another thing to note is that new arguments are easier to get away with lay judges because they're less likely to know or be able to precisely demarcate when an argument is permissibly new versus impermissibly new. So for those watching, it's totally okay to be a little bit more sketchy with new arguments in front of more of a lay panel because you're more likely to get away with it and it's harder for your opponent to police it.
For sure.
Okay, we'll keep going.
Is everyone ready? For their case, before I begin, it's going to be a brief observation. As an overview, if you didn't hear the argument in summary, don't evaluate in final focus. Letting them make new arguments that weren't in summary are unfair. It doesn't let us respond. With that said, let's interact with their case. The response that wins us the round are two things that get totally dropped in summary and rebuttal that Morgan extends. We say that A, Saudi Arabia has a $600 billion sovereign fund with which they can spend on whatever they want, and B, Knights explains they have a stockpile of all necessary spare parts, equipment, munitions, maintenance, etc. that can help them fight the war for decades. That's what he concludes. It's fantastic evidence. The only thing they say is that, well, you can't replace all of these things. If you have $600 billion, you can pay for the engineers, you can pay for whatever systems you need, you could even buy them from someone else. They don't explain to you what the key distinction is. Saudi Arabia can handle all of this, and here's the important part. What they then say is, well, okay, in Grand Crossfire they say, well, guess what Saudi Arabia can't pay for? They can't pay for intelligence. Okay, even if we assume that's true, even if we assume that in their world Saudi Arabia loses intelligence, why does that mean they stop fighting the entire war? When they decreased airstrikes by 80%, that wasn't because of just the threat to limit access to intelligence. Their evidence doesn't say that. At that point, the only possible incentive they could have to make Saudi negotiate is limiting intelligence. And that is not sufficient to solve the entire problem. With that said, they can't solve the Yemen debate because Saudi Arabia has no incentive to negotiate if their military is just fine. Let's cover our case. It is very easy to see how we're winning this argument. The Ahmed 19 evidence explains that America is militarily protecting the Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan And what Ahmed also concludes that they drop is that no other military is credible enough from now deterring Turkey from intervening. There are 3 new answers to our contention that are in second summary that weren't in rebuttal. I'll answer them anyways. The first thing to say is that it didn't happen in 2011. Yeah, because we had a residual force in 2011. The next thing to say is that, well, in Syria, there wasn't a genocide. Are you serious? In Syria, Turkey is still fighting the Peshmerga because it wants to take control of Syria. What we do see is whenever America withdraws, Turkey comes in and kills millions of Iraqi Kurds. You know that empirically, and voting in negligence of that interest is wrong. Vote neg.
So what do you think about your speech? What do you think it does well? What do you think it does poorly? How does it really help resolve this debate?
I think one thing it does well is I really sit on the defense and just pick like 1 or 2 points and just really unpack them and go through step by step the entire sort of chain of implication as to why that point means that they don't have access to their argument. That's something that's really critical in the final focus in front of the lay judge. You need to make 100% sure that the lay judge is in fact able to understand the full implication of your argument to the nth degree, because if the judge doesn't understand the implication to your argument, then it won't get evaluated. And when you have a lot of arguments floating around and around, it's imperative that you're able to prioritize correctly. So that's one thing that I think I did well. One area that I thought I could have done a little bit better was probably some more impact calc on the genocide argument. I sort of just went for like the ethics point almost, and the way that I was framing it at the end there, which isn't like a real like weighing mechanism per se, but I think that a little more work done there could have been helpful.
Yeah, I agree with the impact calc part. It feels like you're putting yourself in the position where you have to win a reasonably high level of defense to your opponent's case to access your own case, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it does deviate a little bit from what seemed to be the game plan earlier.
Definitely.
Okay, we'll wrap it up.
Okay, is everyone ready? I don't think I have any prep time left. Okay. I'm going to be starting on my opponent's case and then moving back to our case, okay? All right. Starting now. Start on my opponent's case. Even if we don't prove to you that Iran can sufficiently completely deter Turkey, we think that Iran is enough to be enabled that the Kurds are not absolutely massacred. Why do we know this is true? Well, first of all, my opponent's own argument about Syria getting invaded by Turkey is not a genocide. They say that Turkey has gone into Syria and is doing attacks. This is true. They never read you a single piece of evidence as to how many people are dying, how many people are getting displaced, how many people are now joining ISIS because of these sectarian tensions. They have no quantification by the end of this run, because just because you invade a place does not mean that you successfully committed genocide against everyone. Does not mean that you displaced everyone. In fact, we would posit that my opponents do not have the statistics to back it up, because it simply isn't true. The genocide is not as large. At the end of the day, even if it were true, my opponents have never mentioned as to how many people are infected in Iran. In our case, we give you the very clear evidence that the Saudi Arabians are committing the vast majority of the deaths in Yemen. That's 330,000 children in the next 2 years, 14 million people on the brink of starvation. If we get Saudi Arabia out, that is the vast majority. That is millions and millions of people getting benefited. So if we have a chance of reducing the conflict in Saudi Arabia and Yemen, we win this round. Move to our case. The important thing is, even if my opponents prove to you that Saudi Arabia can continue the war, they do have $500 billion. They are able to buy these other things. The question is it in Saudi Arabia's interest to buy all these things and continue the war? Which is why our 80% evidence is, again, beating our opponents. When Saudi Arabia saw that the United States was no longer as committed to them, Donald Trump promised to pull a couple of troops out, and he said, we're not going to protect you against Iran. That's when Saudi Arabia reduced their airstrikes by 80%, and they also went to negotiations. This evidence is not well responded to until the first final focus. And either way, we tell you that the evidence is simply not what my opponents say it is. They're trying to misconstrue it. We give you the argument that A, the United States creates a security guarantee. Saudi Arabia can afford to be this bad in so many conflicts because we back them in every conflict. And B, we tell you that the United States helps them with so many things. Again, the argument is not that Saudi Arabia can afford to fight. It is will they afford to fight? And they clearly have not. Our history shows our probability, and we're outweighing on every single number here. Please vote for the affirmative side.
Okay, some final thoughts on that speech, and I guess the debate as a whole, what you think the main points of contention will be?
Yeah, overall, I think that one of the biggest problems with the speech is that there wasn't like a whole lot of clarity we got after he went over his case. It felt like his case flow was still a bit muddled at the end of the speech. And the other problem is that the response he takes to our genocide scenario is that the genocide, and to use his words, like, isn't as large as they say it is. That's never a very good position that you like saying those words. That's never the position you want to be in, especially when you're like in front of parent judges. So it feels like we got them on their back a foot at this point, lay wise, by the very end of the round. It seems like there was enough disruption to their narrative, to their clarity, and enough of a push from our argument that it makes sense why we came out with the W in this round.
I agree. And I think that another thing to note is just that I don't think there's a ton of impact calc in either of the last two speeches, so it feels like the judges are going to have to decide the amount of is there a sufficient defense one to the other team's contention, and like basically just comparing the risk of each contention, because there's not a ton of comparison being done about which one's more important. So it's going to come down to the relative amount of defense that each side has, which makes it a little bit messier from a lay perspective, I think, because that's a very sort of technical evaluation. So I can see how this debate could be messy and unpredictable from a lay standpoint, because both teams have good stories that are being told, but it's really just a question of who has a greater risk of theirs.
Right, for sure.
Yeah. Any concluding thoughts you want to share before we wrap it?
Nope, I think that about does it.
Great. Well, thank you for watching this round analysis. We hope it was helpful. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the day.